It's wonderful to be with you tonight. But, Larry, I hope no one came tonight to hear me either. I hope you are here to listen to the Spirit, and hopefully the Holy Ghost will be in our midst, especially on this wonderful Friday evening before Easter. What more could we do? That wasn't staged, but out of the darkness comes light. Wonderful. I do want to thank the John A. Widtsoe Foundation and Jacob for that fine introduction, and the Los Angeles Temple Visitors Center for inviting me to be here tonight. I count it as a special privilege. Anytime I can talk about the Savior. Every year I come back to trying to understand a little better the trial of Jesus. I've tried to understand it from a lot of perspectives. Not just legal, as the theme you might have suspected. We'll talk about the law a bit tonight. But there's so much more linguistically and personally, historically, culturally, intertextually. The reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so deep and so profound that every time I come back after spending another season trying to understand it again and again, I appreciate new insights that always seem to come. But I also am more and more reminded of how little we really know of these eternal matters. Elder Bruce R. McConkie once said that we must approach this subject in particular of what happened on the night that Jesus was arrested, taken, interrogated, tried, painfully tortured, judged, crucified, and died. And then, for 3 days, nights, went to the other side of the veil, and there, in the paradise where he first went, greeted people, set up the church, organized preaching among the spirits, and then went not only just to the gate of hell and knocked on the gate or even opened it, as some scholars recognize. Some Christian scholars are willing to say that Jesus actually did, as 1 Peter chapter 3 says, as he went to hell, the depth of all existence. A few scholars are willing to say he not only knocked on the door, but that he went into hell. And there commenced the preaching of the good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ, that the atonement was now available to all the living and all the dead. First Peter was a very important player. We'll talk about him a little more as we go on. In the events that happened during the arrest of Jesus, the cutting off of the ear, the denying. So he didn't really deny Jesus. But when asked, did you know him? He said, no. And you remember President Spencer W. Kimball said that he thought Jesus had said, Peter, before the cock crows 3 times, you shall deny that you know me, so that you will be protected and be able to do what you must continue to do, which several years later, decades later, meant writing 1 Peter chapter 3 so we could know what Jesus did during those 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb. Well, looking for new things, one of the things we're going to try to do tonight, and let me just say, Let me just read. I want to read with you what Peter said, because I think it sets a tone for all that we'll say tonight. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 17 to 21. For it is better, Peter says, if the will of God be so, that ye suffer for well-doing. We do good in the world and we expect things to go well. But if it's not the will of God for us to have an easy way, then it's better for us to suffer. Now, it's better for us to suffer for well-doing, he says, than for evil-doing. For Christ himself, who certainly did no evil, has also suffered for sins. The just, and I would say the innocent, for the unjust, us, the guilty, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, and that happened, but quickened by the Spirit, by which also he went and preached unto the spirits in prison, which sometime were disobedient, when once the long-suffering, patient God waited and allowed time. Why didn't the flood happen immediately? God allowed time so that Noah could build a ship. And while that ark was preparing, a few were able to be saved, that is, 8, by water. God allows us time in much the same way. Peter is saying that this is a type and a shadow, that in a like manner, baptism doth also now save us. Not, he says, by washing away the filth of the flesh, but there's something else that baptism does. And this is the new thing that people haven't noticed until recently. Not the washing away of filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. What on earth does that mean? The word answer here, it turns out, is a legal term. I'm sorry if I see things legally, but it's only recently been the case that in the Oxyrhynchus papyri from Egypt, we have a lot of legal documents contemporary with the early founding of the Christian church in the first century. And there are a lot of contracts that we find there. And contractual language always is built on an offer that is extended, and then an acceptance of that offer. And the acceptance, in Greek terminology, is an eperotema. And that's the word that Peter uses here to talk about the answer that baptism is. It is our response to the offer that has been given by Jesus. And through baptism, we then complete the covenant relationship or the contractual relationship, making a covenant that we will then, through good conscience, through our best efforts, be able to escape the destruction that we otherwise would suffer. And this is made possible by the resurrection, Peter says, of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is on the right hand of God, angels and authorities and powers being made subject to him. Well, I couldn't think of talking tonight on the night when Jesus was actually doing this without mentioning that. And let me just say one other thing about a Catholic friend of mine who wondered about how far did Jesus actually go into hell. And as I said, most scholars said he just knocked on the door. But this Catholic said, if the church is really universal, and if it is meant to save every human being, it must also extend to those who are in prison, not just those who are in paradise. I don't know anyone except Joseph Smith, who through the 138th section of the Doctrine and Covenants revealed this. It says, but if the church is really universal, it must be so. He then wrote an article asking, are Mormons Christians? And his answer was, yes. And they are Christians on steroids. Well, tonight, I really appreciate being with you, and I love celebrating Easter, reading the testimony of the witnesses of the New Testament of the resurrection of Jesus. And it's my hope and prayer that tonight my comments will strengthen the spirit of Easter for you and help you to walk a few steps today where Jesus walked and to know more certainly of the reality of the atonement of Jesus Christ, and that you may feel him close to you as we walk in his path. I'm also pleased with the recent celebrations of the centennial of the 1915 publication of Jesus the Christ by James E. Talmage. This is an inspiring and eloquent presentation of the mission and personality of Jesus, the Anointed One. And despite being somewhat historically dated, there are many good reasons why this bold exposition has endured for over a century as an uncompromising testimony of Jesus. By all accounts, and for many reasons, it's really remarkable, especially when you consider that James E. Talmage, the father of 8, published this book less than 4 years after he became an apostle. For some of my remarks tonight, I want to focus on and key off of one chapter in that book. This is chapter 34 in Jesus the Christ. It's called The Trial and Condemnation of Jesus. To add some new perspectives to everyone's appreciation of Talmage's legacy, but at the same time, there are some places in this chapter which we can certainly understand that could use some thoughtful adjustments amidst our well-deserved commendations. Surely the trial of Jesus is the most famous and infamous criminal trial in history, and people have written about it profusely. On the handout, if you want to look at the side that shows a bibliography, this is just a quick example of books, most of which on this list have been published in the last 10 years. So if you want new light on all of this, well, you know where to find these books, and actually they're wonderful books. We'll talk about some of them in a minute. But if you notice, just going down the list, books about Pilate, books about Caiaphas, Raymond E. Brown, now that's the oldest one on the list here, 1994. Raymond E. Brown, a Catholic scholar, 2 volumes on the death of the Messiah, considered by everyone in this field to be a place where you should start. It's really, really good. Jonathan Burnside, an evangelical scholar of Bristol, God, Justice, and Society, recently published, I also use as a textbook in my courses on biblical law at the law school. In any event, a few others worth mentioning. If you haven't read Pope Benedict, this is Joseph Ratzinger's book, Jesus of Nazareth, 2011. A remarkable thing that a sitting pope would publish a book on the life of Jesus. It's very sensitive, very delicate, very understanding, and up to all academic standards. Ratzinger was a professor at the University of Regensburg in Bavaria, a city I served in when I was a missionary in South Germany. About 4 years before he came, I was a missionary there, and that's where, by the way, I discovered chiasmus in the Book of Mormon. We never got to meet each other, but I did correspond with him at one point, and actually got a letter from one of his monsignors thanking me for it. But I like his book a lot. Robert Webb, that collection, Key Events in the life of the historical Jesus is also good. And watch out for this one, John W. Welch, Miracles, Maleficium, and Maestas. I had to throw that one in, but that was one of the main publications that I've produced on the trial of Jesus, which I like to mention. And also the last one, Amanda Whitmer's Jesus the Galilean Exorcist. What does that have to do with tonight? You'll find out. The exorcisms, the miracles of Jesus, played a big role in the trial of Jesus. Well, all of this material is new. It makes me wonder, wouldn't it be fabulous if James E. Talmage could rewrite or could have written from scratch Jesus the Christ with all of this information? He read widely, and he cites about 40 other works in his other chapters. Interestingly, there was so little written on the trial of Jesus back when Talmage gave his original lectures that would become the basis for Jesus the Christ. Those lectures he gave in 1905, 1906. There's so little written that he cites almost nothing, except for a couple problematic things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he couldn't have been expected to have known all that we know now, a whole century later. Now, one of the best kind of resources now, you almost need a wheelbarrow to haul this one out. But this is on your list, Chapman and Schnabel. It's 891 pages long, called The Trial and Crucifixion of Jesus, published just in 2015. It's a mandatory reference work. It's got a lot of Greek and a lot of Hebrew in it, but all of it's been translated into English. Here are all of the primary sources that have ever been used by people in analyzing what's going on in the trial of Jesus, from a Jewish perspective and from a Roman perspective. I call this the Joseph Smith Papers of the trial of Jesus. Here you have all of the primary documents. So that one I'll refer to again later this evening. Now, on the other side of your handout, I want to draw attention here as we go through our discussion to 4 trends that have been materializing in the last decade or so, coming out of this new wave of publications that help readers to appreciate Jesus and Jesus the Christ. The first of these paradigm shifts is number 1 on your list: solid recent historical information about details in the life of Jesus. There's been a lot of new archaeology and a lot of new information come forth. As far as I know, there are no bombshells here. There's nothing that has said we now know that the New Testament got it all wrong. In fact, we now know that they got a lot of things right that people had never suspected. Now, for example, confirmations come from things like the finding of a paving stone in Caesarea, where Pontius Pilate had his office as the Roman procurator in charge of the area of Judea. He wasn't at home in Jerusalem. There's a big fortress there, the Antonian fortress. But Pilate is down on the seacoast, on the shore of the Mediterranean, at that same place. This was a palace built by King Herod I, but the Roman governors took it over, and that's the place where Paul, 30 years after Jesus' death, will be held for a year and a half while they are validating whether Paul is actually a Roman citizen or not. But there in that Caesarea palace, there's a sidewalk that has Tiberius' name and Pilate's name right there. Well, this doesn't tell us everything we'd like to know about Pilate, but it certainly removes any doubt about whether he was actually there. And he's not mentioned very often in other sources. So people have wondered, is that a historically accurate fact in the Bible? It appears to be. How about the finding of an ankle bone with a nail through it, attached to an old piece of wood? dating to the time of the first century. You can see this in the Israel Museum, if you go. If anyone wonders whether crucifixion was ever actually performed the way the New Testament says, we at least have this one case. Now, it's not Jesus' ankle, but it does say. And they were creative, I mean, kind of in a masochistic way. When somebody asked me, so what was the standard way of crucifying? Well, there was no standard. We're not sure why maybe they just used whatever they had at hand to make a scaffolding or a cross or something. Or maybe they're trying to attract attention to each one of these crucifixions because crucifixion would be done in public. They're making an example of these people that they are crucifying, saying, don't do this, because look what can happen to you if you do. So it's a public display, and you know, when you watch the Super Bowl, you don't want the ads to all look exactly the same, right? PR people know that you want to attract attention, so you do it differently. So we don't know exactly how crucifixion happened, and some people wonder, well, did they ever do it this way, that the New Testament? Well, yes. We now know that, at least on some occasions, it happened. How about Caiaphas? You know a lot about Annas. But Caiaphas, he's a major player in what's going on here with the trial of Jesus, and we know very little about him. So it was interesting to find an ossuary, a stone box, that the bones of a deceased person were put in after they had been treated and dried and so on, but stored so that their posterity would be able to have the bones of their ancestors in a tomb close by. And on that stone box is the name Caiaphas. Very interesting. Well, how about another ossuary that was found of the same time period with an inscription that apparently reads, one who is of the house of David. We had no other archaeological evidence that people were still considering themselves in the house of David, descendants of King David. Jesus, of course, was called Son of David by people who were welcoming him as he came through Jericho. How about the recent find of a synagogue in Magdala? This is the town on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee where Mary Magdalene came from. Previously, people didn't even know that there were antiquities, foundations, and buildings covered up by the silt there on the banks of the Sea of Galilee. Somebody wanted to build a hotel there. And Israeli law says that if you begin to dig a foundation and you find anything old, you got to stop and call in the archaeologists. Well, what they had, right where the swimming pool was going to be, was a synagogue. A first century synagogue, and how do they know it was first century? It was a coin that was found in the ruins, dating to the time of Pontius Pilate. Did Jesus visit that synagogue? Maybe. We don't know whether there were other synagogues. They're still excavating. But this is just brand new, 5 years ago. And most interestingly, in that synagogue, they had a stone. It's a fairly good-sized, solid stone just box. It looks like a box. We don't know what they used this for. Maybe they spread the Torah scroll out on it and used it in the synagogue as some kind of a resting place for the sacred scriptures. But it's kind of low. You'd have to bend over really to read that, so I'm not convinced that that's what it was. But why is this stone interesting? It's got carvings on all four sides and on the top. And it is a model of the temple in Jerusalem. You can see the menorahs, you can see the pillars, you can see the Holy of Holies, you can see on top the open of the heavens, the symbols for the firmament above, separating heaven and earth. Wow. What does this tell us? Nobody before thought very much about the Galileans being interested in the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke only say that Jesus went to the temple once, the last time. But John tells us that he's there all the time. He goes for lots of festivals, for Hanukkah, for the Feast of Tabernacles. And now we know that there in Magdala, in that part where Jesus probably spent, it's not very far from Capernaum. These people are, they're Pharisees, they're pious, they're keeping the laws strictly, so they can be holy and go to the temple. This is consistent with what John tells us, and what we're hearing. So you get my drift here. These are historical details that, by strengthening the specifics, help us to know even more surely the generalities. Although these things don't prove that everything in the Gospels is absolutely truthful and accurate as it has come down to us, the presumption now is much stronger than it used to be. And if all people can do is presume, if all people can do is hope that this is true and have a reason for the hope that is in them, Moroni says, you can take that hope, and with that hope you can ask. You can ask, seek, knock, and Jesus promised, it will be opened unto you. Well, while not all historical opinions have shifted because of this kind of new information, most works now recognize that there are solid historical elements, particularly in what we are hearing about the trial of Jesus. Not long ago, people thought that these accounts were fiction, but that is definitely changing. And, of course, Talmage, 100 years ago, took them seriously. And, as we'll see, many of the things that Talmage stood for, at least the important things, have fared quite well. Now, it's well known, this is the problem, okay? In Jesus the Christ, published in 1915, there's a very long endnote, 3.5 pages long, where Talmage just quotes a person named Walter Chandler, summarizes. Are you all familiar with this footnote? This long footnote where he's going through all these illegalities, and everything imaginable went awry. The Jews flagrantly not following their laws, supposedly. At least under first impression, they give the idea that the trial of Jesus was totally illegal. Now, it's interesting that Chandler's material was tacked on at the end of chapter 34. If you actually read what Talmage wrote in chapter 34, in the body of the text, he never mentions any of those arguments. He never even mentions the problem of illegality. Why? I think we now know a little more about how Talmage went about writing Jesus the Christ. I mentioned that lecture series that he gave. He gave that in 1905, 1906. Well, guess what? Chandler was published in 1908. So Talmage had already formulated his account of the trial of Jesus before Chandler's book was published. But he realizes it after, says, oh, I'm going to stick this in. I'm not sure how much he thought about it. Maybe he felt sympathetic. Wow, Jesus was treated so badly. Just your heart's tug, your heartstrings are, you feel the sympathy. After all, he wasn't allowed to remain silent. His Fifth Amendment rights were violated. Oh, they didn't have the Fifth Amendment. He wasn't given a public trial. Oh, no trial in the Jewish world was public. Oh, okay. Well, but you have all these. Why was that so attractive to him? Well, it might be that Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, of course, were martyred in circumstances that were flagrantly illegal. We know that for sure. And so we're kind of drawn to that, to say, well, maybe that's what happened to Jesus too. But if you follow the logic of that very far, what happens? If the trial had been legal, according to this argument, Jesus wouldn't have been killed. He wouldn't have been executed. And then what happens? He's supposed to die. He has to die. And in fact, Talmage is at great length to say, Jesus voluntarily submits to this. He could have caused all kinds of different outcomes, but he knew there was only one outcome because he was there to do the will of his Father, and that had one outcome. And that's why he could patiently suffer a lot of just incomparable pain and agony to prove his complete devotion to doing the will of his Father. So I'm not sure that showing these illegalities really serves a very good purpose, although certainly there were some problems. But there's an ironic twist to it. And this is a little bit tedious, but I want to walk through a bit of the last century's history of what's happened in the trial of Jesus in scholarship. Chandler's arguments were actually taken and read by a lot of people. And one person who read them was a French scholar named Jean Juster. And in 1914, Juster published a book about the trial of Jesus. And he said, you know, when those Jews come and say to Pilate, we have no power to put anyone to death, and therefore we bring Jesus to you. Remember that line? Juster says, no, wait a minute, if they're lying about everything else, I'll bet they're lying about that too. And indeed, I think they are. Because the Jews did have power to put some people to death for certain reasons. But there were limits on which ones they could carry out and which ones they couldn't. Now, it may have been doubtful whether they had the power in this particular case or not. And it may be that when they bring Jesus to Pilate, they are simply being deferential, saying, Pilate, if you want this case, we'll be happy to turn it over to you. Hoping, after all, that he would then take the rap. The chief priest would rather not put Jesus to death. After all, he's very popular. Well, for a lot of reasons. I mean, Pilate, he's only been there for a few years. The Romans haven't even been there for very long, about 25 years. So the Romans are pretty weak. They only have a few hundred soldiers in the whole area of Judea. There are a few centurions around, but no legions. And I think Pilate was, can you imagine what it would have been like if you're Pilate there in Jerusalem? And the mobs are there, and it's so crowded, you've never seen anything like this. You're a Roman. You don't get what's going on here at all. He's really out of his comfort zone. But you can see why maybe the chief priests would have hoped that he would have done something different. Well, that ploy doesn't work, and how that plays out is another question. But Juster's argument was then picked up by a German scholar, Hans Lietzmann, in 1931. Lietzmann said, now wait a minute. If all of these things are supposedly going on that shouldn't be going on, does that make sense that this even really happened? Does any court really violate every law in the books? And if they're lying on this occasion, why not on all others? And Lietzmann argued that there were so many problems with the trial of Jesus in the gospel accounts that the whole depiction of Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin simply cannot be accepted as historical. Now, the historical approach to the Gospels has, of course, been the prevailing approach for the last 50 years. If you can't prove that things actually happened historically, then all we have is a historical record that has been given to us by someone for a particular biased purpose, right? And that's the way these texts get read. A lot of the texts were then read as not historical, but aiming at showing how evil the Jews were. Now, people argued that the Romans really did kill Jesus. But the gospel writers didn't want to blame the Romans because the Romans were now persecuting the Christians. So the idea was they have to somehow appease the Romans. And they do that by saying, Pilate, you were really a nice guy. It was these Jews that did all the bad stuff. That's the so-called the way the Gospels were being written. You follow what's going on there? Well, the inadvertent consequence of that was, especially in the Middle Ages in Europe and beyond, anti-Semitism. This is what Pope Benedict XVI very skillfully argues against, that the Gospels are not anti-Semitic. It shouldn't be read that way. But the Gospels were read that way, especially in Germany with Leedsman. 1931, what's coming? The Holocaust. And what happens to the trial of Jesus scholarship after the Holocaust, when so many Jews butchered, burned, for many reasons, but one of them, because they had killed Jesus. I served in Nuremberg, where a lot of those Nazi newspapers were published. After World War II, books were published by lawyers like Karl Winter in Prague, who dedicated his book to his aunt. He names them aunt, uncle, brother-in-law, father, friend, who died at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Mauthausen, on Auschwitz. Why? He wants to argue that it was totally a Roman affair, that the Jews had nothing to do with it. This becomes the dominant view in the 1950s and 60s, so dominant that we have a whole treatise on the trial of Jesus written by Chaim Cohn, the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, also pursuing that argument. Cohn's argument is that when Jesus was taken by the chief priests and arrested that night, they were trying to help him. They wanted to just say, be a good man, be a brother. Just drop some of these things you're saying, because if you don't, it's not going to be pretty. And you can see an interesting argument there. Well, this idea that it was either Jewish or Roman is one of these big point 4 on your outline. We're kind of skipping down through this a little bit quickly, but point 4 is that people have now come to realize that the trial can't be understood as either Jewish or Roman, but both. This couldn't have happened without collaboration, without awareness, without things going on together. We'll come back to that in a minute, but just quickly, if you think about that, do you think that Caiaphas could have ordered the temple guard, and maybe they even had a few Roman soldiers who went out to Gethsemane that night? How did they see their way? Do you remember? You've got a band, we don't know how big, but probably a pretty good contingent of men. They're going to arrest what they think may be at least 12 men. So I think they took at least that many. So it's a fairly large group. And how did they see their way to Gethsemane? They had, middle of the night, torches. And to get from the temple over to the Garden of Gethsemane, you have to walk right beneath the walls of the Antonia Fortress. Everybody is on high alert there because there's so many people in Jerusalem. The Roman guards are certainly awake. If they see a torchlight parade going over to Gethsemane, what are they going to do? Unless what? Unless they've been notified. This is a new thought. But I can't imagine that Caiaphas didn't tell Pilate, by the way, we think we're going to be able to apprehend this man who's been a problem. We would like to let you know that we're going to do that. I can't imagine it happening without that. And I can't imagine that they would have shown up on Pilate's doorstep at 5 a.m. with a case of this magnitude without alerting Pilate that if they were able to arrest Jesus, they would bring him. You follow that? Now, this is some of the kind of new thinking that I think helps you to kind of follow what's going on, putting these players together and seeing what's happening. But, I mean, I know the Romans got up early, but they didn't get up then. So what do we make of this? The Chapman and Schnabel book summarize all of what's going on here with 4 different propositions, and they determine that we can view the proceeding with the Sanhedrin as plausible historically if you understand that proceeding as not a formal trial, but as an investigation in which the members of the Sanhedrin had some non-judicial consultative function. Okay, that's number 1. I'll come back to that because I think they're onto something there, but there's more to it than what they've said. Second, they conclude that Roman conquest of any territory in the Roman Empire did not substantially alter that region's local legal practices. Local communities in the provinces could still craft and employ their own laws. But number 3, they had to watch out that they didn't somehow violate Roman interests or do something that would require Roman involvement in legal or administrative matters. So the provinces weren't entirely free. You know, it's kind of, that sound familiar? It's kind of like state law. You can do certain things as long as federal law doesn't clip your wings, right? Okay, but that's number 3. Number 4, it's now quite clear that even a Roman prefectus, I mean, Pilate is not a governor, he's a low-level administrator, he is not of the senatorial class, he is of the equestrian class. But even that, we now know, he had full legal authority, including the sole authority to decide a capital case if he wished to. He could defer, he didn't have to, but he would have taken the case if he thought it was important enough for Rome to do so. Now, it turns out that Pilate actually will defer. He tries to offer some other alternatives, especially with Barabbas, but it doesn't work. And he then says ultimately to the chief priests, go and do what you want. Whatever you want. It's not absolutely clear in all of the Gospels, but that's mostly what happens. Now, then who is out there crucifying Jesus? We know there's a centurion there. What's he doing there? We don't know. Were there Jewish temple guards there? Maybe they were there at the arrest. Certainly the temple guard, the Jewish soldiers, had taken Jesus to Caiaphas's house. Roman soldiers would not have done that. Roman soldiers would have taken him to the Antonia fortress. And if the Jewish soldiers were there protecting the temple, and after all, one of the main things they were worried about was Jesus had said, I will tear this temple down. And in 3 days I'll build it back up again. What's he talking about? They didn't know. But they feared that he had the power to do some amazing things. And this will become a crucial point for us to recognize that people haven't recognized, is that these people are afraid. They're afraid that Jesus has incredible powers. They've heard that he could still the storm. They've heard that he could feed the multitude, that he could drive out devils and demons. The first question that Jesus is asked when he gets into the temple, the day after his triumphal entry, he's there healing the sick. Of course, he casts out the money changers too, but he's working miracles. And the chief priests come up to him and they say, and get the words, by what authority are you doing this? That's the question. What do they mean? Well, there are only 2 powers or 2 authorities that could possibly be in their minds. It's either by the power of God or it's by the power of the devil. And you remember back in Mark chapter 3, one of the very first things that Jesus is doing is driving out spirits, and they go into swine, and the swine go down and into the Sea of Galilee. I suppose those swine must have been owned by Gentiles, right? Maybe the Jews were raising swine, I don't know. But somebody wasn't happy with that outcome. He lost a lot of all of his herd. Swine, are they in a herd? A swine herd is the guy who takes care of them. What's a bunch of swine called? No, pigs. What? You have a whole bunch of pigs? Is it a flock? No, I don't know. Anyway, all those pigs, they go and they die, and what happens? There's a lawsuit. Somebody brings a lawsuit against Jesus. Now, I don't know if he's asked for damages here, but who do they bring in? Once again, of course, the lawyers. Yes, they bring the scribes, the lawyers from Jerusalem. Wow. And what do the scribes from Jerusalem want to know? They ask him, are you doing this by the power of Beelzebub, of the devil? And Jesus answers, a house divided against itself cannot stand. Meaning, I'm doing these things for good purposes, right? I'm driving out evil spirits. Look at this man. He's better off now than he used to be. Isn't that a good thing? And what happens to the lawyers? They go away. They don't pursue that cause anymore. But that's the underlying question. Why? Because if you are trafficking in evil powers, if you're doing your wonder working for a bad purpose, guess what? It's illegal. Not only is it illegal, but if you use those powers and those wonders to get people to come follow me instead of following the established religion, if you are using these powers to say your sins are forgiven, a radical thing, when the only way to get your sins forgiven, according to the established Jewish temple culture, was to go and sacrifice at the temple and use that process. But if you're saying, look at these miracles and come follow me, guess what? You are acting in violation of Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 1, that says, and even if a man comes and shows you signs and wonders and then leads you as a seducer to go follow other gods or ways, you shall put him to death. Oh. Okay, this is a serious question, and it's so serious that we now know that under the rules of the Sanhedrin, in order to be a member of their Supreme Court, there were certain things you had to know. 4 of them. One of those 4 things was you had to be able to distinguish between good miracles and bad ones. Because everyone recognized that Moses and Aaron, look at all the miracles they worked, right? Aaron's rod, they had the battles with the priests of Pharaoh. So there must be some miracles that are acceptable, but they also knew that there were bad ones, bad purposes. And we have a case from about 70 BC where there were a whole bunch of, they call them witches, but we don't know what they were doing. But they were somehow conjurers or sorceresses. We don't even know whether they were male or female, but there were 70 of them in Escalon. And they were taken, and people were so afraid of the powers that they had and the curses that they might invoke on people that the Sanhedrin then took them and crucified them, hung them, and killed all of them without a trial. Oh my goodness. They really worried about this. Why? Why are they worried about miracle working? You'd think that would be just perfectly wonderful. Well, if it's used for a bad purpose, it's not wonderful. But more than that, you see, they don't understand miracles the way David Hume taught us to think of them, as breaking natural law. Miracles are things that we can't explain because they just happen outside of scientific reality, right? That's what we think a miracle is. And the word miracle and magic and so on, we have to use advisedly here because we don't understand what they are thinking the way they did. But people in those days, including the Romans, especially the Romans, thought that there were demons, spirits, gods. I mean, how many gods did the Romans have? Plenty of them. And they are real. And they can influence people. Why do you think before the Romans went to battle, they took a bird and they threw the bird up in the sky? They watched which way it was going to fly. Of course, the priest had to orient himself to the right cardinal directions so that when he threw the bird up, he could see whether it is going to the left, which is in Latin sinister. That's the bad side. Or to the west, auspicious. That's a good one. They're divining. And, major decisions in the Roman Empire were based on this sort of thing. Why? They believed that there were powers far beyond what we can see and deal with. Now, the Jewish people didn't believe in all these gods. They have texts that say, "Thou shalt not allow the witch to live," Exodus 22. You cannot have necromancy, conjuring up the spirits like the witch of Endor. This is not a good thing. Because if you are invoking the names of these other demons or beings and calling upon them, then what? You are not worshiping the one and only true God. You are worshiping other gods, which is in violation of one of the Ten Commandments. You begin to get the mentality of what's happening here? Well, so why have I gone down this long path? The trial of Jesus could only make sense if you could find a way for both the Jews and the Romans to agree that there might be a problem here. The Romans could care less if Jesus has said something offensive about the Jewish God. People say bad things about the Greek gods. Who cares? So the charges of blasphemy, not a problem. They're not going to take an interest in that. They're not going to take an interest in the charge that Jesus was somehow a revolutionary. He didn't even carry a sword or a dagger. He was a pacifist. You live by the sword, you die by the sword. He's not like the robbers, like Barabbas, who, by the way, they were preparing to crucify. Jesus takes Barabbas' cross. Right? They were going to crucify 3 men. And the Jews got, of course, Jesus substituted him for, well, we're not sure. I'm not sure who was there in that crowd screaming for Jesus to be killed, crucified him, not Barabbas. Who was Barabbas? He was a zealot. He's kind of a Robin Hood figure. A man who didn't like the Romans and went around assassinating, pillaging, plundering. He's like the people that when you went down from Jerusalem and you fell among robbers who make the roads unsafe, beat people and leave them half dead. That's the Barabbas kind of guy. But he works in a band. We call them bandits for a reason. They work together as a group. And if you caught one of these people, robbers were put to death, and often by crucifixion. So here you have Barabbas. But guess what? He has a band. He has followers. He has friends. In fact, he's got a lot of Jewish zealots who are cheering him on. There weren't very many people in that crowd, I think. The Praetorium, where the Jews brought Jesus to talk to Pilate, is a small place. I don't think you could get more than 50 people into it. And if 25 of them are Barabbas's friends. Now maybe they showed up that morning, simply they're thinking he's going to die. And maybe the other two also, the other two robbers, they might have had friends too. The Pharisees are not there. Why? They wouldn't go in because they didn't want to defile themselves by having contact with Gentiles just before the Passover. Oh, so who does that leave? And by the way, the Pharisees were a minority group in the Sanhedrin. 2/3 of the Sanhedrin was controlled by the Sadducees. They are the secular Jews who run the temple. That's an important point, just a little footnote here, because the rules that Chandler talks about are found only in the Talmud. The Talmud, of course, is written down a couple centuries after Jesus and finished about 5 centuries after Jesus. So they're late recollections by Pharisees of what they thought the law should be. We don't have any idea what the Sadducees thought the law should be. But there's no more reason to believe that the Sadducees agreed with the Pharisaical rules than that the Republicans today would agree with the Democrats. It's basically the same problem. So, you've got Sadducees there in Pilate's court. And they're not concerned about purity. They only want to be sure that they keep Pilate happy so that they can keep the temple franchise. Caiaphas is the high priest as an appointee of the Roman government. So they want to work out something that's going to work. But Caiaphas is smart enough to know, I've got to come up with a cause of action that Pilate would take an interest in. Here's my theory on this. And on the bottom of the list, on your back to your handout, I've listed 4 things that I published on this subject. One of them is the legal cause of action in John 18, 29 to 30. You can click on it, search for that, and read more about this. But what I find very fascinating, and this is new, is that when the Jewish leaders, and it's not the Jews, it's simply the chief priests, a small group of people who were the aristocracy running the temple, bring Jesus to Pilate. And Pilate says, and this is how the Greek reads, what legal cause of action do you have against him? What is the idea, the cause of action here? And they answered, according to the King James translation, we wouldn't have brought him to you if we hadn't found him a bad guy, a malefactor. Now that's, what are they saying? Is that responsive to his question? Tell me the cause of action. Oh, in Greek, what it says is we would not have brought him here if we had not found him kakon poion, doing kakon. Or some texts say if we wouldn't have brought him if we had not found him a kakopoios. What is a kakopoios? A kakopoios is a Greek word for a magician, a wonder worker. And guess what? Under Roman law and under Jewish law, as I mentioned, the 70 witches from Ascalon, what do you do with them? You crucify them. You hang them. And a kakopoios, under Roman law, you also crucify them. That was the normal punishment. For these people who are working outside of the norm, in a zone that is beyond the physical normal reality. So you crucify them to raise them between heaven and earth, to get them out of this sphere. That seems an appropriate kind of way of punishing that matches the crime. Now, I see this as terribly important because it helps you to understand why Pilate would have said, okay, I can recognize that as a problem. And he almost lets Jesus go, doesn't he? Jesus said, well, my kingdom's not of this world. And we think, oh, well, then Pilate should not care. But no, I think Pilate thought about that. Okay, then you've got a kingdom that's up there in the heavens. That makes you even more dangerous. We think separation of church and state. We think separation of heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. But that's not the ancient way of viewing things. If he's got a kingdom that's even above this earth, then what did the Jews say to Pilate about that? If you let him go, you are no friend of what? Caesar. You are no friend of Tiberius Caesar. Now, how can that make any sense? How could Jesus somehow threaten the emperor of Rome, who is absconsed on the Isle of Capri off the coast of Naples, in the most secure fortress in the known world of its day? What could Jesus do if he does have a kingdom and a power that is beyond this world? He can invade curses. He can put threats spiritually. He can kind of like, it's almost, we might call it voodoo. And that's not what the Romans thought, but it's a way of kind of thinking. They recognized these as real powers. And they were fearful powers. People were scared of these kinds of things. And so it would be possible. And let me just mention that one thing that people haven't noticed, and even Chapman and Schnabel don't have this one in, is that there was a senatus consultum. This is a ruling of the Senate in 16 AD. Jesus is, a late teenager when this is passed by the Senate, making it a capital offense to curse Augustus Caesar, or his wife Julia, or his son Tiberius. This is against Roman law, should that happen. So these kinds of curses were taken seriously as problems. Does that all begin to kind of coalesce in your mind to give you an idea of what Jesus is up against, or what is going on here? I think there are a lot of lessons we can learn from this. Let me just try to mention a few of them in the time we have left. One of them is that when people get scared, they don't think very well. We all know that. And politically, we've got lots of fears running around. But when people get scared, they act irrationally. They aren't at their best. Mostly they act precipitously. They act quickly. They're worried. They've got to do something. If you look in the gospel accounts about the reactions and what emotions we are told they have, the word fear shows up the most. And another one of the articles there at the bottom of your handout, the very last one, the fear factor in the trial of Jesus. The fear factor. What I argue there is, if you read carefully, it says that the chief priests are afraid. They fear Pilate. They fear the people. They fear the mob. Who else is afraid? It even says that Pilate, in the Gospel of John, says, and he feared exceedingly. Svodra. I translate that, Pilate was scared spitless. Now, even if he does kind of back off and kind of deal with this, he knows that he's under a lot of pressure. We've got time concerns, and you've got lots of people there in Jerusalem. He's afraid that there's going to be some kind of a mob. There's going to be a riot. And that's the last thing he wants to have to report to Rome, is that he hasn't been able to control, and in fact was maybe one of the big factors in setting off a riot. Now, Jerusalem is a tinderbox. And it will only be about 35 years after the death of Jesus that the Jewish war will begin. And those hostilities are already quite there. So the fear is there. Who else is afraid? Joseph of Arimathea is afraid. The centurion, when he sees what's happening, he's afraid. Fear, fear, fear is everywhere. Well, I think we can learn something from that. I think we can learn that, first of all, we should not be afraid. We should not be fearful. Let the peace of Christ, in circumstances where you feel like there's a crisis, if there's a national crisis, find a way to lower the thermostat. And things will probably go a lot better. Another thing is that I said everyone is afraid. Think about that for a minute. People have often asked, and point 3 here on my list of things where we've had shifts, people used to just say, who killed Jesus? Who is to blame? And what one thing was he accused of? That is a modern American way of thinking about things. In the ancient world, first of all, you weren't accused of any one thing. There was no grand jury. You didn't receive an indictment. You didn't know what you were going to be accused of. You walked into trial, and your enemies in court could throw anything they want at you. And you have to stand there and respond. And if you don't, if you remain silent, the law was, if you don't answer, it is an admission that the other person is right. I mean, in this kind of, we would consider it a free-for-all. In fact, the Romans loved to go to these courts because it was like the circus. It was the best entertainment in town. But there were lots of different factors that are going on. And who is responsible for the trial of Jesus? And we like to place blame. We want to know who done it. Sherlock Holmes has infected us. But you know what? In this particular case, the answer is a lot of people. Not quite everybody, but just about everyone. Judas, Peter. Look at all the people who play a role. Who crucified Jesus? Romans, Jews, Zealots. You go down the list. Who wasn't somehow involved? Nephi says in 1 Nephi chapter 19 that the world would crucify Jesus. And I think that's right. And I think, why? Why is that the way it did happen and maybe should have happened? I think it's such a merciful thing that in reality no person, Pilate or Caiaphas or Judas or any of them, have to go through the rest of eternity saying, I was the one. I did it. Carry that guilt forever. This is something that had to happen. When Peter is talking to the very Jews, some of whom had been involved in killing Jesus, this is in Acts chapter 3. Acts chapter 2. 50 days after Passover, Peter, who himself had been in some way at least closely involved with this whole process, said, Ye men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man approved of God among you by miracles and wonders and signs. That factor is still very prominent in his mind. You could have known that he was God. He was approved of God because these were good miracles. Remember, there's a distinction between the good ones and bad ones. But you guys missed it. Which God did by him in the midst of you, right in your faces. As ye yourselves also know, you saw this happening. Him being delivered and the Greek here is much better than the English. Jesus being delivered by, it says, the determinate counsel, and it's spelled counsel, counsel, like advice, the determinate counsel, but the Greek word there is boule, which is the word for a counsel. And the word determinate doesn't mean predestined, but it means determined in advance. That there was a determination reached in advance in a counsel by God and by God's foreknowledge. He was delivered according to a plan that was agreed in the council of heaven. And we haven't read that way before, but I believe that's what Peter is saying. But he was then taken by wicked hands and crucified and slain. Now, it's true that there was wickedness involved. But what was the wickedness? I think Jacob in 2 Nephi 10 even points this out. The wickedness was the failure to recognize that, shown all these signs, Jesus was the one. Stephen will make the same argument to the same Sanhedrin a few years later, saying, Moses prophesied, a prophet like unto me I will raise up, him shall ye listen to. And Stephen says, Moses was a lawgiver. Jesus was a lawgiver. Moses was a miracle worker. Jesus was a miracle worker. Hey, you guys, Jesus was that prophet like unto Moses. And you missed it. And I think if Stephen had sat down at that point, he might have won his case. But you can see what's going on here. There were some wicked people. And what did they do? They failed to recognize when it was put right in front of them. They could have known. That was the problem. And what was Stephen's mistake? He looked up and he should have just kept quiet. We're often told when you have spiritual experiences, sometimes it's best to keep them to yourself. But he said, I see God and Jesus. And, at that point, okay. And they take him out and stone him. Okay. By the way, showing that the Jews did have the power to put someone to death if it was something that they didn't think the Romans would have any interest in. Well, Peter goes on, this Jesus God has raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it. What does that mean? It was not possible that death could hold Jesus. Could not contain him. Well, all right. Can we learn a few things again from what we've been talking about tonight? Faith, knowing Jesus was aware of what was happening. This was all planned. This is not a mistake. Jesus was not a victim. In fact, the word passion, I think, is a problem. We talk about the passion of Jesus, but the word passion comes from the Latin word that also the word passive comes from. When you have a passion, it's something that comes from the outside upon you. And the passions people used to think of as being things that you really couldn't control. Jesus is not passive in this process. He may be silent. But Luke tells us that Jesus, when he sweats from every pore, is not in agony. Well, he was, but it's more than that. Luke says he was in an agony. What is an agon? He was in an agon. That's the Greek word for a battle, a conflict, a trial, a test, even a legal cause, a legal action. What Jesus is doing there in Gethsemane is winning the battle. That's an active thing. And what's he fighting? Death, sin, forces of evil. Overcoming every effect of the fall of Adam. That's his battle. Okay. I want to conclude with just a few thoughts about, well, two other things. Because one thing that has just occurred to me that's new in my mind is the importance of something that happens in John chapter 11. One thing that historians have always worried about is, well, where is the legal trial in the Gospel of John? Because in John, they take Jesus to Caiaphas' house, they have a few people there, but we don't hear anything about accusations. They ridicule Jesus, and then they take him off to Pilate. Where's the Jewish trial? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this is one of the reasons that, back to the handout, point number 2, people used to just think that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were the historical treatment, not John. John is some eternal gospel that isn't historically reliable. We now know from a lot of archaeology that John is, in fact, very historically reliable. And one of the big shifts on my list here is that people now are giving the Gospel of John a lot more credit than they used to for historical value. Which, by the way, is one thing that Talmage instinctively did, as we all do because of Talmage. We read all 4 Gospels together without somehow losing their individual voice, but seeing behind all 4 of them and other things, one Jesus. But people used to think that John wasn't historical because there's no Jewish trial there. But I was reading the other day and thinking about the miracles of Jesus, and what is the biggest miracle of all that Jesus works? Isn't it the raising of Lazarus? Certainly the most conspicuous. And where is Lazarus raised? Bethany. Where's Bethany? Have any been to Bethany? Anybody? Okay. Not easy to get to because it's on the other side of the wall. It's over in the Palestinian section, but it's real close to Jerusalem. If you were a bird and could fly. It's just over the hill from the Mount of Olives. Who lived there? Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. They were wealthy. How do we know that? They had precious ointment. They are probably merchants. A lot of these perfumes were raised down in orchards by Jericho and then brought up and mingled with the best olive oil. Where are they going to get the best olive oil? The Garden of Gethsemane. The olives right there on the Mount of Olives. And they probably made a lot of money selling those things. They had a big house, big enough for what? When Jesus came, was he alone? No. He usually had a whole train, and well, how many of his disciples were with him? Well, maybe 10, maybe a dozen, maybe followers. Maybe some of the women were with them. Can you imagine Mary and Martha? Oh, we got 20 guests here, Martha. No wonder she was worried about all the housework that needs to be done. But it's a big house. And they also have a tomb. How many people could afford a private tomb? Not many. What does this mean? They have friends in high places. And maybe a few enemies in high places. But when Lazarus dies, you remember Jesus knew that Lazarus was failing. And he thought, I just can't go yet. I can't go. I think maybe he even worried, if I go and if I heal Lazarus right there, that's just over the hill from the temple. I've never done a miracle in Jerusalem like this. Yeah, I healed a blind man. I remember a few of these things, but I kept telling people, don't tell anyone. This one I can't keep very secret. Well, he does find the temple, but it's late. It's way late. Lazarus has already been prepared for burial, wrapped in the burial shrouds, put in the tomb. And there's been enough time that he already stinks. He's dead. And Jesus comes and says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoso believeth in me shall not die, but have everlasting life. And to show that he meant what he said, he goes and calls Lazarus up out of the tomb. And Lazarus comes out. And who's there watching this? You see, all of these things, the trial, the death of Jesus, the raising of Lazarus, they're all happening in plain view of lots of people. These are public events. And there are people there who have come from Jerusalem. They're wealthy. They have connections. It says, and many of them believed Jesus and followed him. Remember what I said about Deuteronomy 13, using a miracle? I don't think Jesus is pushing this, but people naturally follow when they see that. How could they not? Well, how could they not? You're a Pharisee. And there were some Pharisees there, and what do? John 11 says, and they ran back to Jerusalem, and they told the leaders of the Pharisees what Jesus was doing now. And what do? They go to Caiaphas. And this is the thing. Caiaphas then convenes the Sanhedrin. They have a whole meeting of the Sanhedrin. And we used to say, oh, this can't be a court because Jesus isn't there. But they try to arrest Jesus, and if he isn't there, he can be tried in absentia. Because all they need is a legal determination that they have reason to believe that he is worthy of death. And after debating, John 11 says they debate back and forth on lots of different issues. Caiaphas finally says, I've heard enough. I'm ready to rule. He says, you people, you know nothing. It is better, and here he cites an ancient Jewish legal practice that we know goes back at least 800 years. He then says, it is better that one man perish than that the whole nation be destroyed. Sounds familiar to us. We won't go into that, but there's another story about that little development. I mention it now, not just as a novelty, but to say this is a legal ruling based on a principle of law. We have then an opinion of the Supreme Court. And what happens after that? Jesus has been found guilty. They haven't, however, sentenced him. They send out an arrest warrant. The last verse of John 11 says that they sent out a mandate. If anyone knows anything about the whereabouts of Jesus, you must report it. Why? They don't need to capture him to convict him. He's been convicted. But they need to decide what level of punishment, who should punish, and is there any way to somehow accommodate the situation and not have to punish. I mean, they could do a lot of different things at that point. Well, they also, in chapter 12, a few verses later, they send out an arrest warrant for Lazarus. Have you ever noticed that in John? I think this is absolutely historical. And why? Why would they want Lazarus? Well, if they think there is some foul play here, and they do say that Jesus is somehow deceiving the people, if they think this is a ploy, if this is a trick, and they call him a planos, a deceiver, Lazarus would certainly be complicit in whatever had happened, or at least would be the best witness that they could then inquire of. Well, all of this is to say that there is a Jewish trial in John. And all of this says that when Jesus is then arrested, a few weeks later, on the Mount of Olives and taken to Caiaphas, the reason that we don't have all of the legalities that Chandler was thinking should be there is because, as Chapman and Schnabel say, this is not a trial. The trial has already happened. This is now a further investigation. They think maybe just to prepare the case to take to Pilate, but I think they were only looking at the sentencing dimension. They decide that. They decide that Jesus should be killed, and they take him to Pilate to see what they can work out. Now, what do we learn from that? The article that I've posted here is called Raising Lazarus. Is Jesus signing his own death warrant? I think he knew what was going to happen. He's been prophesying it. I'll go to Jerusalem, I'll be taken, this will happen. He knows the stakes. Peter, says, far be it from you, that can't happen. And Jesus says, well, remember what happened to Jonah. There's a sign in Jonah. And what was the sign? That Jonah voluntarily jumped off the ship. So the storm would cease. And he is then swallowed by the sea, by the death monster. He's swallowed. For 3 days, he is in the belly of the sea. He's dead. But he then is brought back to life as he is washed up to shore, and by some force, he is given another chance. And Jonah says, okay, I'll go to Nineveh. You know the story. But Jesus says, this is a sign. And can you see how the same kind of thing happened? All right. Well, I just want to conclude here by saying, I have learned a lot from this whole process. One is, I've learned to respect and trust the Book of Mormon and Mormon doctrine as I read the New Testament in great detail. In fact, the thing that dawned on me quite a while ago about how to understand the death of Jesus was in reading King Benjamin's speech in Mosiah chapter 3, where the angel says to Benjamin that the Messiah would come working miracles, causing the blind to see, the lame to walk, and even raising the dead. And the angel then says, and even after all his miracles, they shall consider him a man and say that he hath a devil. What does that mean? They will say that he is working in cahoots with the devil. It's that problem of using the wrong powers. That's what they'll say. And because of that, they shall scourge him and shall crucify him. I think King Benjamin got it absolutely right. I also think that in spite of all of these rational explanations, we cannot overlook the violence, the brutality, agony, weeping, gore, and torture of what we are subjected to in not just one, not just two, but all four of the New Testament Gospels. Fortunately, we as a world are becoming more sensitive to violence, recognizing it for what it is. Why then do the four Gospels require us to, on Easter, on a night like tonight, relive the violence, the brutality, the pain, the excruciating agony, bleeding, whipping, ridiculing, spitting, exhausting. Why do we get dragged through that? And why is it done in such a public way? Who's involved here? Who sees this going on? Everyone in sight. The Jewish leaders, the mobs, the Romans. They put him up and put a sign up above him, crucifying him on the busiest part of the road leading into the city of Jerusalem, going into the gate of Damascus. Why? Why is all this going on? I think there are two reasons why all four of the gospel writers agree on these two essential points. Number one, Jesus died. He really died. He was totally dead. He bore more than any mortal person could, but he died. He was certifiably dead. He was executed by the experts, the ones who knew how to kill someone. He wasn't executed by just having a few rocks thrown at you. Toss him off a little cliff and throw some rocks. How would you know? If he had died in Nazareth, that he was really dead. And then when he just came to, he's knocked unconscious, somehow he wasn't really dead. No. Everything here, step by step, Jesus died. And we know it because everybody was aware of it. This is done in plain sight, in public, by the most powerful people, in the streets of Jerusalem. Can you see the dynamic here? Now, why? Why is it important? Isn't it because the testimony that Jesus was resurrected, that he rose from the tomb, that he rose from the dead, that testimony depends on the proof that he was really dead. And you remember some were worried that maybe he would he'd come back to life, and he'd wake up, he wouldn't be really dead, and then people would say more than they should. They even put the stone on the tomb, they put the seals on it. They want him certifiably dead. And it's the Romans, by the way, who want to be sure that's the case, but the Jews requested. Again, they're working together on that. Well, I think it's because these two facts make it clear that when the apostles see the resurrected Lord on multiple occasions and testify, and there will be, Paul says, 500 men who at one point see Jesus. There are plenty of testimonies that he, in fact, rose from the dead. Let me just end with one of those men who saw Jesus. My favorite, the Apostle John. John was there at the cross. I think John went in to Caiaphas' house with Jesus. He was one of the top 3 apostles. And he would, probably one of the younger ones. He at least can run a little faster than some of them. But I think he was there. I think he heard what was said as Jesus was brought to Pilate. I think he may have even gone in with Jesus and heard what Jesus and Pilate talked about. At least he testifies. And this is in 1 John. And we know that the Son of God is come. We have heard, we have seen with our eyes, and handled with our hands. And he hath given us an understanding that we may know him that is true. And we are in him that is true, even in his Son, Jesus Christ. this is the true God and eternal life. That's John's concluding testimony. He's the one who tells us of the raising of Lazarus. He's the one who, I think, more than any, can be trusted and treasured as a first-hand witness of these things that he records. Well, brothers and sisters, there is much here to ponder, to absorb, to embrace. I don't want to overstate what I have said. I'm still trying to figure out a lot of these things, but I hope you can see the type of work and thinking, scriptural, doctrinal, historical, spiritual, all of these factors, to try to begin to grasp all of the events cautiously, carefully, and understand the complex causes that led up to the death of Jesus. Most of all, I hope that something that I've said tonight may have allowed the Holy Ghost to bear witness to your hearts, to your minds, and to your souls, that you may surely know, as I testify, that Jesus is indeed the Son of God, of whom the Bible, the Book of Mormon, and all holy prophets have ever testified. And I leave you that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.